The envelope was already on his desk when Daniel Calloway arrived at 7:45 that Thursday morning. It had been placed there by someone who knew he would find it before anyone else did, before his assistant came in, before the cleaning crew finished the upper floors. It was a white envelope, unsealed, with his name written on the outside in the kind of handwriting that did not belong to any of his senior staff. He knew that before he even touched it. He had spent 31 years reading people, and he read handwriting the same way he read balance sheets, not for what they said, but for what they revealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout from the building's internal pharmacy log. 3 items were highlighted in yellow: amoxicillin, hospital grade; methylprednisolone, a broad-spectrum antiviral compound the company kept on file for its executive wellness program. Items no cleaning employee was authorized to touch, let alone remove from the building. And next to each highlighted line, circled in red pen by whoever had placed this envelope on his desk, was the same name: Margaret Osei, floor cleaning operative, level 4 through 8, shift end, 11:15 p.m. He set the paper down. It turned to the window. 42 floors below, the city moved without him, indifferent and alive, full of people already in the middle of their days. Daniel Calloway was the majority owner of this building and 3 others like it. It had grown a facilities management company from a single van operation into something that employed 460 people across 5 cities. He had done it by never being wrong about a person. Not once in 31 years had he trusted someone who did not deserve it. And not once had he doubted someone who turned out to be clean. That record, that unblemished, impossible record, was the thing he was proudest of. More than the buildings, more than the revenue. He picked the sheet up again and looked at Margaret Osei's name. She had been with the company for 3 years. She arrived early when the schedule allowed. She left without drama. She was quiet in the way that some people are quiet because they have already said everything they need to say and found it changes nothing. Not the defensive quiet of someone hiding something, but the settled quiet of someone who had made their peace with the world a long time ago. His late wife, Caroline, had liked her. That had been the first thing he noticed, about 8 months after Margaret joined the team. Caroline had been alive then, barely, in the slow final year of her illness, and she had occasionally been in the building when Margaret's shift overlapped with Daniel's late evenings. Once, he had passed the small staff rest area on the 4th floor and heard 2 voices, Margaret's low, unhurried tone and Caroline's softer, thinner voice. And what he heard was not the formal exchange of employer's wife and cleaner, but something that sounded far more like 2 women who understood each other on a frequency he could not access. He had never forgotten that. But Caroline was gone now, gone 22 months, and the grief had done something to him that he was only beginning to understand. It had narrowed him, sharpened his suspicion to a point. He had begun, in the months after her death, to see the world through glass, everything behind the barrier he could look through but not feel. His trust, which had once been his greatest professional asset, had curdled into something that looked like caution, but was really fear. He was afraid of being wrong about anyone, because being wrong would mean the world was less ordered than he had built it to be, and he needed the world to be ordered. He needed it more than he had ever needed anything. He pressed the intercom. His senior operations manager, Patricia Weston, answered on the first ring. Patricia, my office, bring the pharmacy access log for the last 30 days, and find Margaret Osei before she leaves the building this morning. The silence on the other end lasted 2 seconds. Of course, Mr. Calloway. I'll have her brought up. He didn't hear the small sound of satisfaction in Patricia Weston's voice. He wasn't listening for it. He was still looking at the envelope. Margaret Osei stood in front of his desk. 12 minutes later, still in her work uniform, a woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped hair and hands that were very still in her lap. Patricia Weston stood to one side with a printed security report. 2 other members of the operations team were present. The number of witnesses was not incidental. It had been Patricia's idea, and he had agreed without thinking about why she suggested it. He placed the pharmacy printout on the desk and pushed it toward her. Can you explain this? She looked at it. Her face did not change. She looked at it for a long time. Not the frantic scanning of someone trying to understand an accusation, but the slow reading of someone confirming something she had already known was coming. No, she said. I can't explain why my name is on that document. The access log shows these items were signed out under your employee credentials on 3 separate nights. Last Tuesday, the Thursday before that, the week before that. My credentials, she said very carefully, were used. I don't know by whom. Patricia Weston placed the secondary report on the desk, a supplementary security note, freshly printed, flagging that Margaret's access card had been used after her signed-out time on all 3 nights. The times on the log were 15 to 20 minutes after her documented departure. She had already been gone when the items were accessed. He did not notice this. It was looking at her face, and he was looking for the thing his talent usually found instantly, the micro-shift of the guilty, the adjustment that the innocent never needed to make. And he could not find it, but he also could not stop. The grief had taken his instrument and retuned it, and he didn't know that yet. I have to ask you to hand over your access card, Mrs. Osei, and your locker key. I understand, she said. I'll need you to wait here while the locker is checked. I understand, she said again, in the same voice. The locker check found nothing. He had not expected it to. But the absence of evidence did not dismantle the presence of the report, and Patricia was already talking about pattern, about precedent, about what the other staff would think if this was not handled with consistency and visibility, about the message it sent. He looked at Margaret Osei one more time. I'm going to have to suspend you pending a full review. I'll need your badge. She reached into the pocket of her uniform, removed the badge, and placed it on the edge of his desk. She did not throw it. She did not slide it. She set it down with the same care she might have used to set down a cup of good china. And she looked at him, and she said it then, quietly, levelly, the way a person speaks when they have already given everything and have nothing left to perform for anyone in the room. I have never taken a single thing from this house that belongs to you, Mr. Calloway. Everything I have ever carried out of here, I carried it to keep something alive. It didn't know what to do with that sentence. It was too complete. It sealed itself off at both ends and left no space for argument or comfort or dismissal. He had heard thousands of denials in 31 years. They were usually longer. They usually had gaps in them, places where the truth leaked through. This one had no gaps. It was carved out of something he couldn't name. She stood. She straightened her uniform jacket. With one small, precise movement, she sighed, "Good morning, Mr. Calloway." And she walked out of the room, and Patricia Weston closed the door behind her with a soft, definitive click. The room was very quiet. What no one knew was that Patricia Weston was the one who had placed the envelope on his desk at 7:42 that morning. What no one knew, not yet, was that Patricia had been supplementing her salary for 18 months by signing out pharmaceutical items and redirecting them to a private resale contact. The pharmacy access logs were her logs. Margaret's employee credentials had been borrowed for 3 nights when Patricia needed a name that wasn't hers on the record. It was efficient, and it was cruel, and it was the kind of thing that only works when the person you've chosen looks to the person with power, like someone who might. Daniel Calloway sat alone for 40 minutes after they all left. He did not look at the suspended badge on his desk. He looked at the window. And the thing he was feeling was not satisfaction. And it was not certainty. It was the specific unease of a man who has just used a hammer and is no longer sure what he hit. It picked up his car keys. It told his assistant he would be back by 2. He did not say where he was going, because he didn't fully know himself. He told himself he needed air. It told himself he was going to drive, clear his head, come back with perspective. It told himself a lot of things on the way down in the elevator, and none of them were quite true, because what he actually needed was to understand that sentence. Everything I have ever carried out of here, I carried it to keep something alive. He needed to understand what that meant, because he was Daniel Calloway. Anne had not been wrong about a person in 31 years, and if he was wrong now, the hammer was still swinging, and he did not know what it would hit next. He found her on foot, 2 blocks from the building, moving at the pace of someone who had already decided on their direction and had no interest in hurrying. It pulled the car, a black Mercedes, clean and conspicuously out of place the moment it left the business district, into the slow lane and kept half a block behind her. She did not look back. She walked as she did everything, without performance, without anxiety, with the particular contained grace of someone who carries a great weight and has learned to make the carrying look effortless. It had expected her to take the tube. She didn't. She walked for nearly 40 minutes, and as she walked, the city changed around her in the way that cities do when you cross the invisible lines that money draws. The pavement grew older, the gaps between buildings wider and less deliberate. The shop fronts replaced by takeaways and off-licenses and a betting shop with a handwritten sign in the window. The trees disappeared. The bins along the pavement were older, dented, cracked at the hinges. The Mercedes felt wrong here the way a tuxedo feels wrong at a bus stop. He was aware of it. E had not been aware of his car as a symbol in a long time. She turned down a side street, then another, then through a car park to a road that his GPS assigned no name to. It simply showed his location hovering in an unmarked space between two labeled streets, as though the software had decided this place did not need identifying. The road was unpaved past the first junction. The streetlights were spaced for a wider road and provided almost nothing for the one they stood over. The houses here were not derelict. They were lived in stubbornly, each one showing the specific exhaustion of a building that has been fighting gravity for years and intends to keep fighting, because the people inside have nowhere else to go. She stopped at a building near the end of the road. It had been, at some point, a converted flat above a ground-floor commercial unit. The commercial unit was empty now. The window boarded, and the lettering above it faded to almost nothing. The residential entrance was on the side, a narrow door with a buzzer panel. She had a key. She let herself in without buzzing. He pulled the car to the curb and sat. He didn't know how long he sat. Long enough for the engine to feel strange. Got out. The air was different here. Colder in the way that car-free streets are colder. And there was a smell of damp stone and something faintly chemical, clinical, out of place. It walked along the side of the building slowly, the way a man walks when he is pretending to himself that he is not doing what he is doing. The window on the ground floor of the residential side was covered with a thin curtain, but the curtain did not reach the edge of the glass. There was a gap of 3 or 4 inches on the right side. It stopped there. He told himself he would look for 30 seconds, and then decide what to do. It was a fair man. He had always been a fair man. And a fair man, he reasoned, confirms before he concludes. He heard her first. Not her voice, not words. A sound. The particular soft sound of someone moving through a space they know by heart, in low light. The quiet competence of someone who has arranged a room to function perfectly for the one person in it who needs it to. He heard the tick of something being opened, a case or a bag, the light creak of a chair, and then a voice, soft and young and very clear, from somewhere inside the room. Moon, you're early tonight. The voice was the voice of a girl who was too tired for her age. Not a child's voice, a teenager's voice, but quieted somehow, slowed down from the inside. The voice of someone who had spent time in a place where sound was kept low because too much of it costs energy. Finished early. Margaret's voice, different from how it sounded in the building. Warmer, lower, unwound. How are you feeling? Same. A pause. Better than yesterday, maybe. A little. It shifted his angle at the gap in the curtain. The room came into partial view. It was small. There was a bed against the far wall, a proper hospital-style bed with a raised head and side rails, the kind that does not come cheaply. It was the single most expensive thing in the room by some distance. Next to it was a drip stand, not currently in use, and a small folding table with medication organized in 2 rows. Bottles and blister packs, arranged by color, small labels on each one in Margaret's precise handwriting. On the wall above the bed was a photograph of a man laughing at something outside a frame. And a child's drawing, done recently, he thought, because the hand that made it was not a child's hand, but it had the deliberate simplicity of someone recreating something they loved without caring how it looked to anyone else. It was a drawing of 2 women, and they were holding hands. The girl in the bed, she was 16 or 17, he thought, angular in the way of someone who had lost weight they hadn't had to lose, turned her face toward the door as Margaret came into the narrow slice of room he could see. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. She opened her bag. She removed 3 items, and he recognized them with a sensation that moved through his chest like cold water. The antiviral compound, its specific blue-capped bottle, unmistakable. A secondary medication in a pharmacy bag with a different label, and a sterile packaged item he couldn't name. She set them on the folding table. She arranged them with the same care as the others, added a label in her handwriting, and then she took her daughter's hand. "The doctor called?" she asked. She sighed. "The new protocol might help slow it down," the girl said. "She said she'd know more in 2 weeks." 2 weeks, Margaret said. Then 2 weeks. Mum. The girl's voice shifted, lighter, with something underneath it that was neither hope nor resignation. But a kind of childlike directness that belongs to people who have stopped needing to be careful with their words. "The man from the building, the owner, he was kind to you. Before today." A pause. "It was," Margaret said. "He was. Before today. Do you think he knows? About Dad?" Another pause. "Longer." "No," Margaret said. "He doesn't know about your father." A step back from the window. He moved to the car, and he sat down, and he could not start the engine. His hands were on the wheel, and his hands were shaking. Not the fine tremble of cold, but the deep involuntary shake of a man whose body has processed something that his mind is still refusing to file. He sat there, and the street was very quiet, and the only light came from the window, with the gap in the curtain, and he could see from here the faint edge of the light inside. And he knew that inside that light, a woman was sitting on the edge of her daughter's bed, and her daughter was ill, seriously, terribly, expensively ill, and the medication on that table had not come from nowhere. "Everything I have ever carried out of here, I carried it to keep something alive." He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. He had not cried in 22 months. He had been too busy being certain. He had been too busy building the glass wall between himself and everything that might reach him. He had thought it was strength, and it wasn't strength. And the girl's voice through that gap in the curtain had found the one crack in the glass and walked right through it. He sat there for a long time. He thought about Caroline in that restroom on the 4th floor, talking to a woman he didn't fully see. He thought about what they might have talked about. He thought about what two women, one in the slow retreat of illness and one in the daily maintenance of it, might find to say to each other that a man like him would not be able to hear. He thought about the man in the photograph on the wall, laughing at something outside the frame. And he thought, "I don't know how he died." And he understood, sitting in that car, on that unnamed street with the engine cold, that not knowing was the same as not asking. And not asking was what he had been doing for 22 months, with everything and everyone. He drove home. He did not go back to the office. He spent 3 hours on the phone the next morning with his head of security. And what came back to him in the early afternoon was everything he should have had before he called Margaret Osei into his office. The actual access log with timestamp verification, the footage from the pharmacy corridor that showed Patricia Weston using a borrowed badge, the pattern of discrepancies that went back 18 months, and that no one had flagged because Patricia was the one who reviewed the discrepancy reports. She had been meticulous. She had been trusted. She had been, in the language of his business, a key person, the kind of person whose position makes them invisible to scrutiny, because scrutiny is what they administer. He also found, in those 3 hours, a name in the archived HR files, a name attached to a workplace incident report from 4 years before he acquired this particular building, a maintenance accident inadequately documented, resulting in the death of a contracted worker. The contracted worker's name was Kofi Osei. He had worked a 12-hour shift on a scaffold that had not been correctly certified. He had fallen. The report had been filed. The family had been offered a settlement that was not enough, and that they had accepted because they had no power to refuse, and the incident had been closed. The building had changed hands. Daniel Calloway had acquired it 2 years later and inherited the staff and the records and the silence of everything that had been arranged before he arrived. He read the name of Kofi Osei for a very long time. He picked up the phone. The all-staff meeting was called for 4 o'clock in the ground floor conference room. It was not billed as a disciplinary meeting. It was billed as a company review. Patricia Weston arrived with a new set of reports under her arm, and the expression of someone who has prepared well for an event she believes she has already controlled. She had not been told what the meeting was about because she had not needed to be told. She assumed she knew. Margaret Osei was called back to the building at 3:50. She did not know why. She arrived in the clothes she had been wearing when she left. The same jacket, the same careful stillness, and she stood at the back of the room because she had been asked to attend, and she had come. and she held herself in that room the way she held herself everywhere. Upright, composed, without a single performance of any kind, her eyes level, and her hands quiet at her sides. He stood at the front of the room. He sighed, I made a mistake yesterday. I want to address it in front of everyone who was present for it, because what was done publicly must be corrected publicly. He sighed, Margaret Osei did not take anything from this building. The evidence against her was fabricated. The person responsible for both the original theft and for the fabrication of that evidence is Patricia Weston, who has been suspended pending a full external review and a referral to the appropriate authorities. Patricia Weston stood up. She said his name once, Daniel, in the voice of someone who has played a losing hand and knows it. He looked at her and he said, very quietly, please leave the building. Patricia and two members of the security team were already at the door, and she left the way villains leave when the room finally sees them, not in triumph, not in drama, but in the suddenly diminished reality of someone who has been smaller than they appeared all along. The room was very still. He turned back to the gathered staff, and he said, I also owe this company a fuller accounting of something I found yesterday. And I owe one person in this room an apology that I am going to begin today and work to make meaningful for as long as I am running this company. He looked at Margaret Osei at the back of the room. She was looking at him. Her face had not changed. She had the face of someone who has long since stopped expecting the world to correct itself, and who is therefore watching what is happening in front of her with the specific, careful attention of someone who is not yet sure whether to believe it. After the meeting, he asked her to stay. The conference room emptied. The two of them sat at the long table, and he did not perform what he needed to say. He said it simply because it was the only register she would accept. I know about Kofi, he said. I know about your daughter. I understand now what you were carrying out of this building. And I want you to know that I understand there is nothing I can offer you that begins to address what was taken from your family. But I intend to try. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, her name is Adwoa. She's 16. She was diagnosed 14 months ago. What is she fighting? She told him. It was a rare progressive condition, the kind of illness that falls into a gap between standard coverage and experimental treatment. The kind that is expensive not because the treatment is exotic, but because the gap itself is expensive. And the families who fall into it are the ones who cannot afford lawyers to find the exits. The medication she had taken, the compounds from his pharmacy, the ones she had not asked for because asking had not been possible, were a supplemental protocol recommended by Adwoa's consultant. Not covered. Necessary. He nodded. He said, from today, Adwoa's treatment is fully covered. All of it. I will have the arrangement confirmed in writing by end of business. That is not conditional on anything. That is simply what is right. She looked at him. Something moved in her face then. Not gratitude, not quite, but something quieter and more complex than gratitude. The face of someone receiving a thing they have needed for so long that receiving it feels like a different kind of grief. A reached across the table and placed a second sheet of paper in front of her. He said, I'd also like to ask you to consider this. She read it. He watched her read it. It was a contract for the position of director of the newly created Callaway Group Employee Welfare Division. A permanent role, a real salary, and a mandate to audit every gap between what the company's 460 employees were owed and what they were actually receiving. The division would be the first of its kind in the company's history, and it would be named, he explained this carefully, the Kofi Osei Welfare Program. Not as an apology, not as a gesture, as an acknowledgement made permanent and visible that a man had worked on a site that belonged to this company and had not come home, and that the least the company could do was make sure that from this point forward, the people who did come home were properly cared for. She was silent for a very long time. Then she said, I'll need to speak to Adwoa. Of course, he said, and I want full access to the HR records, every file. I've already seen what a gap in oversight can do. You'll have it, he said. She nodded. She folded the contract carefully along its existing crease, with the same precise care with which she did everything with her hands, and she placed it in her bag. She stood. She looked at him with the directness that had never left her. Not in his office, not at the back of the conference room, not now. She sighed. Your wife, Caroline. She talked to me sometimes on the late nights. She told me once that the thing she was most afraid of wasn't dying. It was that you would confuse the grief for wisdom. He could not speak. She said you were the best man she'd ever known, Margaret said, and that the grief would try to convince you otherwise. She picked up her bag. She said, "Good evening, Mr. Calloway," and she walked out. He sat alone in the conference room for a long time. The city darkened outside the windows. The building's cleaning crew arrived. The night shift, his people, invisible in the way that all essential things are invisible, until the moment you finally learn to see them. He listened to the sounds of the building settling around him, the machinery of an ordinary evening, the particular quiet hum of 460 lives, interconnecting without knowing it. On the table where the contract had been was a single thing he hadn't placed there. He hadn't noticed her set it down as she left. It was a small photograph, worn at the corners, clearly carried for a long time. A man laughing at something outside the frame. The same photograph from the wall above Adwoa's bed. He picked it up carefully, held it. The window behind him was closed, but the curtain moved anyway. Just once, just gently, just enough to be noticed by someone looking for it. He was, in that moment, looking for it. He held the photograph of Kofi Osei, and he felt the curtain move, and he closed his eyes, and for the first time in 22 months, the glass wall was not there. The Kofi Osei Welfare Program launched 6 weeks later at a quiet ceremony attended by all company staff. Margaret Osei stood at the front of the room, not to the side, not at the back, but at the front, with Adwoa beside her in a chair that the event staff had brought without being asked, because someone had noticed and acted without waiting to be told. Adwoa was thin and bright-eyed, and she watched everything with the specific attention of someone who has learned that paying attention is a form of gratitude. She clapped when her mother's name was announced. She sighed something quietly to her mother that made Margaret smile. The full, unheld smile of someone who has been carrying a weight so long they have forgotten what it feels like to set it down. In 2 years, Adwoa's condition had slowed, not stopped, but slowed, in the way that careful and consistent treatment slows things, in the way that not falling through gaps slows things. She was enrolled in school 3 days a week, and she was studying, her mother told Daniel once without being asked. Biology. She wanted to understand, she had said, why some bodies fight and some bodies don't, and what the difference is, and whether it's something you can change. The fund covered 12 families in its first year, 30, one in its second. It was not named in any press release. It did not exist to be seen. It existed because a woman had carried what she needed to carry every night, through streets with no names, to a girl in a bed with a drawing on the wall. And because a man had finally stood in the cold outside a gap in a curtain and understood that the world is larger than his certainty and deeper, and far more full of love than any inventory report has ever been able to measure. If you have ever felt invisible to the people you work hardest for, if you have ever carried something heavy in silence because the explanation would cost more than the carrying, then you know what Margaret Osei knew before Daniel Calloway did. You know that dignity is not the absence of suffering. It is the decision made fresh every morning to let the suffering make you larger rather than smaller, to let it teach you the shape of other people's pain, and to go on carrying what needs to be carried, not because anyone is watching, but because, somewhere at the end of a road with no name, something is waiting that you promised to keep alive. What a person carries out of the dark every night and into the hands of the people who need it. No security camera in the world was ever built to record that.